Hi, I'm Sophie and this is my advanced 3D project. For this project I have created a carousel. My scene is inspired by the carousel within the Last of Us Left Behind DLC. However, my scene takes place years before the game, showing the carousel in its prime. It is located in a seaside pier environment and the horses were inspired by Disney's Mary Poppins. So conversion to real-time environments. My scene has certain elements which have the potential for future development to make the carousel into a working game. I have rigged the carousel with sockets so that the horses can interact along with the cameras as seen in my cinematic, but it can be developed further for character interactions so that the characters can ride the carousel. The animations are all functioning for a game and set up so that more blueprints and scripts can be added for additional animations like stop and start. Changes made. I've made a lot of developments from my alpha presentation, but the main element I changed was the background and scale. I received some amazing advice from Mark Ranson, who said that the background isn't necessary and to focus more on the carousel by scaling it up. I asked my peers for their opinion and they agreed. Therefore, I made a simplistic landscape in U4 and also scaled the carousel by about 10 times. Time management. I created a Gantt chart to help guide me through this project. I generally followed this time plan, as when I created the chart I thought about the hours in each week available to achieve what I wanted. However, I did have to replan certain elements as I needed to implement them a lot earlier than planned. This is because I wanted to show these effects within the presentations. I had to prioritise aspects and reorder my time plan to ensure I was able to achieve what I wanted. I think I did manage my time well for this project, as I didn't include the additional elements like the second horse mesh or the animations of the horses, and I managed to achieve everything that I had planned and had time for these extra desirables. For the lighting, I wanted my scene to be late in the evening but have a warm and welcoming feel. My main inspiration was an image of a carousel on a pier shown in the top left. To achieve this I had to replace directional light, which left the sun underneath the map, and this was causing no shadows in my scene, and resulted in a less realistic outcome. To fix this I had to add a second directional light to the scene with a low intensity so that my scene had shadows, and I think that this really improved the outcome. For my scene I had 2 matinee cameras and 3 blueprint cameras. The blueprint cameras were difficult to understand as they wouldn't capture when rendering. To overcome this, I had to look for different tutorials which showed a way to play the camera. I had to create a blueprint node sheet to reference a camera in the carousel blueprint so that the camera would play after matinee. It was important to get these cameras working because throughout the development of my scene, the feedback I received was that the camera at the end, referring to my alpha presentation, was the most successful, and because of this I added more cameras to the blueprint to achieve a better cinematic based on the feedback I received. I also used the rule of thirds, the golden rule, the rule of triangles and the rule of lines to determine the position of the cameras, and also used a metronome to further plan the timing and pace of my shots to achieve a better cinematic. Materials and textures. Originally, I wanted to use substance for this module for the textures of the horses, but because of software restrictions, I had to quickly rethink the texture in progress and use ZBrush polypaint. I had to paint on the high poly model, but only had a working UV sheet for the low poly asset in-game, so I had to bake the paint from the high poly to the low poly UV sheet using X normals. This did create a few errors with the distance between both the models as the paint wasn't always correct. However, forums and tutorials helped me to overcome these errors. I then needed to make the glossy effect in UE4 that I was seeing in ZBrush and Marmoset. I used a PBR workflow to achieve this look and also used PBR for the carousel model. The main aspect I had a problem with was the mirror effect on the carousel as I couldn't get a reflective surface. However, with help from staff and peers, I managed to achieve a working material. I also used bump maps on flat materials to give them depth and make them more realistic, and also created ambient occlusion maps, roughness maps, and more detailed PBR maps to make materials look more detailed and effective. Real-time modelling techniques. I modelled my carousel from high to low poly and ensured that the model was looking appealing, still in low poly. I also created UV and light maps for the models and gave each component a reasonably sized resolution for the textures, UVs and light maps based on the scale of the object. For the horse, I had to retopologize in ZBrush using Z Remesher and Decimation Master, and I had to work through different tutorials to guide me through the process so that I didn't lose too much detail. This was so that I could import the horse and several other horses into the engine without slow loading times or crashes. I have also created many modular assets throughout my project. For example, the carousel has many modular components. I modelled each component separately and then brought them together into one document and duplicated them to form the shape of the carousel. The props within my scene are also modular, with some having different texture sheets to give them a variation. The horses are also modular, with 2 variation models, but each have been duplicated throughout the carousel and given their own texture sheets to give extra characteristics. Animated elements. My carousel is animated, and to achieve this I had to split it into 2, the top and the base. The base is the bottom part, and this is the part I animated. I used basic rigging and animation skills to achieve the animation of the carousel. I added a root bone in the middle and animated this for the rotation, and then added bones around the base where the horses would be. I imported the animation and skeletal rig into UE4 and set up the animation. I transformed the bones where the horses would sit to sockets in the blueprint and set up the animation. I then parented the top part of the carousel to the root bone so it was one whole object and followed the animation. The horses were animated using a similar method and imported and parented to the sockets on the carousel blueprint. For the timing of the horses' animations, I used notes in the blueprints which told the animation to start at a certain time. I then had to offset each horse with different timings to get the movement changing so that one would be up while the other one would be down. I also animated the light materials to change colour using parameter values and keyframe values in the Matinee editor. Post-processing, visual effects and editing. I added different effects into the game engine and made my scene more stylized and aesthetically pleasing. I imported an atmospheric fog and a height fog into the scene and made sure that it was in the background and not interfering with the carousel. I added reflectors into the scene to help reflect the materials, and a light importance volume and a post-processing volume. I also added a particle emitter to the scene to get the dust effect, and had to tweak the settings to achieve the outcome in the video. The depth of field was more time consuming as I had problems with the effects proven correctly. But after watching tutorials and seeking help from my peers, I was able to get the effects working on the cameras, which added a focal point to my scene. I also edited the outcome in After Effects. I used a warm photo filter to enhance the orange and yellow tones. I added a brightness and contrast to improve the look of the video, and added a red gradient to the scene to get the colours more prominent. I also added a stabilising warp to some shots on the carousel to make the movement more smooth as it was wobbling slightly. I added a Gaussian blur to the scene and masked out the area in the background to apply the blur to. This made the depth of field more prominent, and then I lastly added the title page and music. I showed my video to a few peers and questioned them about the music and chose the one that was more favoured. Overall, I felt that I achieved the goal I set myself and created an outcome I am proud of. I've learnt a lot through the project, such as sculpting skills, anatomy, animating skills in Year 4, blueprint development, poly paint and texturing techniques, cinematography methods, post-processing effects and time management. I feel that my skills have advanced and I can use what I have learnt for future projects and development. Thank you for listening, and please wait for my final cinematic to play.